So I think that we look at healthcare at the moment, we can't help but think of 2020, and the sector has underperformed the market, as there are the traditional concerns about the potential for political disruption to the healthcare system, and perhaps on the same traditional concerns ahead of election, but on steroids with this one, with drug pricing reform, as everyone on every side of the aisle seems to have their own proposal for that, and of course Medicare for all. But what I'm excited about today is that we get to look past 2020 into the future and see some of the fundamentals of healthcare remain the same. There is aging population, there is huge unmet need, and now we are getting more and more exciting new technologies that will help us address some of those issues. So I thought that given you come from such different areas of healthcare and such different stages of investment, it would be great if we could start by sort of introducing yourself and saying what is the most sort of exciting opportunity in healthcare for you now. So Alex, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Alex Denner from Sarissa Capital. Sarissa Capital, we're an investment fund, basically value-based investment fund, where we use the tool of activism in most of our investments to sort of bring the companies to be run more optimally for shareholders. We think one of the issues in healthcare is that when you have a product that is successful, it's a really good business, and they have very high margins, very high barriers to entry that can allow for lackadaisical or suboptimal behavior that just doesn't occur or you can't get away with in most other industries. And we try to bring that and leverage that through usually going on the boards of the companies. In terms of we're very excited by the opportunity set in healthcare now. I think it's a really fun time for the sector generally. We are sort of contrarian in the sense that we're very excited by, we were talking earlier, we were very excited by, let's say, gene therapy. We see on average sort of better investment opportunities in some of the sectors that are maybe a little bit more out of favor and less kind of sexy. And this is something that happens with the sectors where they sort of, within healthcare, there's certain oncology nobody wants to do oncology, which was the case about a decade ago, and then a bunch of and most pharmaceutical companies got out of the business, and now it's sort of one of the hottest sectors. And similarly with gene therapy, those are two hot ones, and there's some that are less hot. That we generally find more value, say like in cardiovascular and diabetes. Some of those areas are something that I think there's still huge unmet need, and the pharmaceutical industry is sort of becoming aware again about how many patients could benefit from new therapies there.
Great. Annie Lamont. So we think of us as venture capitalists. We do venture and growth, and we're early to late. So we're all the way from $1 million investments, seed investments, to $60 to $100 million growth investments. And the way we think about innovation is that we are all about lowering costs and improving quality of life. Like that's the mission. I mean, what do we get excited about? I mean, everything we do is about that. And if you define that, innovation as sort of lowering cost and think about it that way, it's software-enabled services and solutions is what we're focused on. And in terms of what's going on now on that front, if you're going to lower costs, the reality is we are completely focused on the end of fee-for-service. That is our utopia. And with value-based healthcare and new payment models, it's really all about business models and payment models. It's not as much about technology. It really is about rethinking how you deliver care and what the business models are around it. And I'll just give you an example that I think is emblematic. If you can create a business model or a payment model that makes sense in an area like palliative care, then you can create a company that affects thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, but you can also create a model that CMS can adopt and then affect millions of people and tens of millions of people. And that's what we've done in palliative care with a company called Aspire that has been focused on the end of life, last year of life. And if you think about, you've probably heard of hospice as a benefit, which is really end of life. We actually backed an entrepreneur that had never worked in a company before. This is his first company, first time CEO. But he created a model where insurance companies would pay him to go into homes and he could identify through an algorithm who was most likely to die within the healthcare claims. Most likely to die in the next 12 months. Get on the phone and call people up and say, I have this great free service for you, and we are going to, through in-home visits and over the phone, support your efforts. And these are people, you don't say, nobody's saying, and you are most likely to die in the next 12 months. It's, we know you're in distress as a family, as caregivers. And 87% of the people called took the service. And then we had 90% net promoter scores, NPS scores in terms of the care that we were giving. And then we had 6 times ROI in terms of the savings that we produced at the company. So this is a company that in a period of 4 years, started, went to 200 million, was sold to Anthem. But what's really exciting about it is that now CMS looked at their payment model and said, you know what, we can do this with palliative care too. And over the next couple of years, they are going to roll this as a standard benefit in CMS. And to me, that's impactful. So, these are the things we're doing. And again, it's all about payment models. The only other thing I'll say in terms of exciting, because certainly if you ask my kids, healthcare is not particularly exciting. But what we think is exciting is that companies like Amazon and Google are coming into healthcare, and that is shifting the landscape in terms of what legacy players are doing. And anything even I don't think actually much comes out of the JPM, Amazon, Berkshire effort. At least we haven't seen anything yet, hope maybe in the next 5 years. But just fear, that fear factor, and look at Amazon buying PillPack and thinking about distribution, and now they bought a clinical care company. These are really important moves, and it's helping to drive innovation, and they're certainly much more likely to work with our small companies.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into that and how those big companies are completely changing the market later on. But Jason, would you like to?
Sure.
Your most exciting
Jason
thing?
Bonadio with Alera Partners. We invest in the public space, and we look for disruptive opportunities, areas where there's unmet medical need, and also being aware of where there's excess hype in the marketplace. And picking up on something that Alex had mentioned, I look back, and when I started in the healthcare investment business back in 2001. The biopharmaceutical industry basically had 3 general types of modalities or treatments that they could use to help treat patients. You had traditional small molecule drugs. Aspirin is a perfect example of that. You had protein or recombinant protein drugs. Insulin is an example of that, and you had the beginning of antibody therapeutics. So, they were very limited in terms of, how drug companies could come up with new ways to treat disease. Today, you fast forward, the proliferation of just the number of treatment modalities that companies have at their disposal really has ushered in an unprecedented amount of innovation. You still have traditional small molecules, recombinant proteins. The monoclonal antibody space has grown into a $100 billion market. 5 of the top 10 best-selling pharmaceuticals are monoclonal antibodies. But even within that space, you now have companies engineering, doing protein and genetic engineering on antibodies, linking them to toxins, creating antibody-drug conjugates, designing antibodies that could, called bispecific antibodies, that could target 2 cells at the same time. You have novel technologies like antisense oligonucleotides, which allow companies to develop biologics that can now treat targets within cells. You have gene therapy, gene editing. So just if you think about the number of treatment modalities that companies have at their disposal, that's why we're seeing unprecedented amounts of innovation when you even compare that to 20 years ago when companies really only had sort of 3 tools in their toolbox.
Yeah, going far beyond the pill, but also much more difficult to spell.
Yeah.
TJ, what do you think is most exciting?
So I'm with Warburg Pincus, lead healthcare investing. I think one of my colleagues was up here earlier, so I won't repeat the commercial, but we're large-scale private equity. In healthcare, we actually follow a lot of the same trends as Oak and how Annie described her practice. But I'd say in general, we're the next phase of an investor in terms of size of our target companies. But we're always looking for companies that are at inflection points in their growth trajectory where we think we can bring something to the table other than just capital in the form of strategic ideas as to how to help management teams reach their objectives and other resources that we can bring to bear as a large global firm. In terms of just kind of listening to the panel here, we play in a bunch of different areas across really the spectrum of healthcare and across geographies. And there's lots of exciting things going on in the world of healthcare innovation around the world. Just listening to Jason's comments on gene therapies and cell therapies and oligos, which is the only way I can describe what you said. We tend to be the investor, as opposed to investing directly in the therapeutic and in the technology, if you will, that is driving that innovation. We tend to be the next step, the derivative, where we like to do, for example, picks and shovel. We call picks and shovel investing into those great end markets, which are seeing themselves a lot of capital accumulation. And so we'll provide the infrastructure that will help support these technologies to get to where they're going. So for example, contract manufacturing type operations that might house gene therapy products and technologies, and or reagent companies that are providing the inputs to a lot of the research around novel therapeutics. So we do that type of investing, but in terms of kind of something that is maybe less esoteric and where we spend a lot of time, and I think something that all of us in the room can think about and experience is just the role of the consumer. So a different area of innovation within healthcare, and maybe a little more along the lines of kind of what Annie was talking about. Pretty much as I look at my portfolio at Warburg, every investment, even ones that are really technology-focused software type investments, have some consumer-oriented element to them today. And I don't think if I were up here 10 years ago, looking at my portfolio 10 years ago, or living in the healthcare environment of 10 years ago, I would be saying the same thing. I think the Obamacare legislation, while imperfect in so many different ways, it did catalyze this sort of revolution of thinking around the consumer and empowerment of the consumer, both in the form of high deductibles that sort of came out of some of the Obamacare legislation and the ACA reforms, as well as other patient responsibility, coinsurance, and things of that nature, which has pushed responsibility on healthcare decisions, as well as financial responsibility to the patient and the consumer. And from that has been birthed so many companies that are trying to address that, whether it's creating a digital front door opportunities for primary care. Primary care was this kind of archaic aspect of the healthcare system, and a primary care doctor would be on this treadmill of seeing 30 patients a day and providing very little direct insights with those patients who really needed the most help. By using tools and technology and by providing support to a primary care doctor, you can do a lot more. And we'll get into it, but we make investments in companies that try to address those consumer needs. So for example, we have an investment in a business called CityMD, which is a large-scale urgent care player in the New York metro area with about 120 locations around the metro area. And it wasn't that necessarily when we made that investment we were thinking urgent care is the end-all be-all in terms of investment thesis. In fact, there are some barriers to entry issues that would have led us in most markets to be a little more discouraged. But what we saw in CityMD was a pivotal role that company was playing for consumers in the marketplace. Net promoter scores of 75, a sort of Apple-like experience when you walk in the door, where you're not ever happy to go see the doctor, but where you're experiencing things as a consumer as you would want to on demand when you need the care. Very short wait times, easy to understand financial responsibility. The things that I think historically healthcare has really failed consumers around, or things that we've addressed through that investment. And now we're vertically integrating, and because our patients, like what we're doing, we're trying to do more for that patient population. And we did so through a big merger with a multi-specialty medical group, where we're now able to provide seamless integrated care, which can serve 90+% of all the healthcare needs of a consumer and their family. And so those are the types of things that we think about as innovating and trying to support the consumer on a very complicated journey, which is healthcare.
Yeah, it's a very, very complicated journey for the consumer, and a very broad industry, as we can see from your exciting opportunities. I wondered, Jason, if you could, take us at the start of the process where the scientific discoveries start to become things that can be commercial opportunities. I mean, what's laid the groundwork for this huge range of investment opportunities that you were describing?
All right, now that's a great question. I think investors, even specialists, forget about this. And if you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, there have been remarkable scientific advances. But if you look at the big ones, you go back to the early 70s, and you had the first discovery of enzymes called restriction endonucleases, and what those are molecular scissors. And that discovery basically ushered in the beginning of the biotech revolution. But it took 10 years to go from the discovery of these molecular scissors to the first biotech drug, which was Humulin, which was a recombinant insulin that was produced in bacterial cells. What this technology enabled was to turn a bacteria into little factories to produce biologic proteins. But that was a good 10 to 12 years from the scientific discovery to commercialization. Also, in the mid-1970s, you had the discovery, scientific discovery of production of monoclonal antibodies, which I had mentioned before. And scientists were able to take immortal cell lines from cancer cells, infuse those with plasma cells, which are the cells in your body that produce antibodies. But it took 10 years to get from that discovery, the creation of something that's called a hybridoma, to produce the first commercially available monoclonal antibody in, I think it was 1986. However, most of the antibodies produced at that time were made in mice, and they had really bad immunogenicity, and side effects were really difficult for patients. So it took another 10 years from that point for the industry to essentially humanize or re-engineer those antibodies. And in 1997, 98, you had the commercial launches of Rituxan and Herceptin, and that really ushered in the golden age of antibody technology. And like I said, now 5 of the top 10 best-selling drugs are monoclonal antibodies, and the industry is north of $100 billion. Today, probably if you wanted to compare where we are with some of the seminal breakthroughs, I think the discovery back in first publication back of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tool in 2012 is probably on par with some of those landmark discoveries that we saw back in the early 70s and early 1980s. But just as we saw going through the recombinant evolution, there was hype, and then there was a letdown, and then there was a renaissance. We saw the same thing in antibodies, where there was a hype, there was a letdown, and then a renaissance, and now it's a viable therapeutic. I think CRISPR also, the gene editing companies, and I think it's a remarkable tool. It's going to accelerate the path of innovation. But if you look at history as a guide, there's a lot of iterative science that needs to be done between now and making a technology that really is safe and could be utilized in a lot of patients. So I think there was a lot of excitement around that when the first publication came out in 2012, and there's a lot of companies that came public promising a lot of things. And I think we're going through a period right now where investors like us have the opportunity to sift through the hype, find opportunities where there's a lot of hype but not a lot of substance, and also find companies that are really innovating and are going to provide those cures. But I think we're still a ways.
So when it comes to CRISPR, what are you looking for that will sort of last the duration, and what might fall away? Because
the interesting thing about CRISPR is, remember, it's a tool. It's a research tool. So it enables a lot of cellular engineering, gene engineering, that you can manipulate cells. But one of the potential side effects is off-target gene editing, and that's one of the things that we don't really know.
So that's editing the wrong genes, or editing genes in the wrong way.
Where you could accidentally, God forbid, introduce a mutation that could cause a cancer or something. So again, if you use history as a guide, there's a lot of hype around these new technologies, and rightly so, but it takes a long time to get them to be commercial.
I think a point to make too is that as Jason knows very well, there can be off-target effects, but there's also a lot that's not understood about these things. So gene therapies can go, and the vector, gene therapy is basically replacing a gene in a broken gene in someone's body, and you have a virus usually that infects the person that does that, and the virus can work properly in the sense that it can introduce that new gene, but our bodies are incredibly complex, and they react in ways that are just not obvious or understood at this time. So that everything can work well technically, and then you still end up having sort of bizarre, kind of unexplainable side effects, potentially even years later.
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement about some of the technologies that doesn't take into account necessarily how much we know about biology.
Right.
Yeah. So Jason gave us a great history of scientific discoveries and how they became commercialization. Annie, what is your history of how we got to this point where there's a lot of opportunity to save money in the system? Obviously, we know there's a lot spent in places that didn't necessarily need to be spent, and also, a lot of pressure to save that money right now.
Well, Jason's reminding me, I did 15 years of investing in biotech, and as I got older, I got less and less patience. No time for it. So I think what's fascinating about healthcare is it's really the only industry where technology has only increased cost. I mean, if you think about technology everywhere else, and even information technology, it's all about efficiency, more productivity, and clearly, obviously from the life sciences side, the technology has been amazing in terms of life-saving drugs and diagnostics. But there's so many technologies that have been introduced because it isn't a free market, right? It isn't an efficient, well-functioning market. If you just look at, there's so many proton beam therapy, or even surgical robots. The reality is I just sat in a room with the heads of many of the major hospitals in America, and they all admitted that surgical robots, in 99% of the cases, don't do better than a good surgeon. And yet it's a marketing tool. So, but who's paying for that marketing? And if you think about what happened with, EHRs are just a really interesting example. Absolutely, we have to have interoperability of data. We did it, so badly. And so that scenario, if you think about all the downstream ramifications of it, the intentions were good, but EHRs have made everyone so much less productive. And now we're unwinding that with new software and technology. So, I think what's promising in the future is that, there are two things that happen. So EHRs came in, and obviously there was meaningful use. And
Electronic health records.
Yeah,
sorry.
Medical records.
Electronic health records. So with electronic health records, what happened was that for you were incented as doctors to adopt them, and then doctors found that they really couldn't be independent, and that they needed to be part of a larger system to really pay for all the technology that was being required of them. And so you had this massive acquisition. So you had 60% of all primary care docs all of a sudden became part of hospital systems, which they became lost leaders. The hospital systems, they were supposed to be referring people into the hospital systems. This is exactly the opposite of what should be happening in terms of primary care docs being separate from hospital systems, controlling 80% of the downstream costs, and then selectively referring to hospital systems only in cases where somebody really needs to be in the hospital. And we are, unwinding that now so that we have 30% of all physicians are primary care docs are employed by hospital systems. So we're moving in the right direction. But it's one of those things where the good news is doctors now need to be aggregated. If you think about it, all care needs to be coordinated to really be good care. It's not just a one-on-one, you go to a good doctor and then they leave you with the door. It's all about care coordination. It really all is about aggregated primary care practices, taking risk on individuals and caring about their downstream health. So that's an area that I know TJ and I are very aligned on. We actually have 5 different investments in primary care. I think there will probably be 4 or 5 primary companies going public next year. And that's going to be, I think, a wave that you see over the next 4 or 5 years of companies that are coming to the public market and really, sort of providing better care and having a new sort of risk model. I think what's interesting on the electronic health record area that's actually technology-based is that we've invested in a company called Notable, and with very simple natural language processing from Google and iWatch, we are now recording everything that's going on in a doctor's practice, and that is automatically being transcribed and automatically being put into an EHR, and it is also automatically doing order entry for your labs. It's doing prescription orders, so doctors don't have to touch any of this. They don't have to do any transcribing. They don't have to do any orders. They don't have to do any follow-up. It is all automatically taken care of. It is saving doctors about an hour to an hour and a half a day. So it's the first thing I've seen that actually transforms a provider experience. And it's also the first thing that changes the whole electronic health record business, which is now sort of dominated by 2 providers, Cerner and Epic in the United States. And so, I think the evolution of that and workflow in the practice is, I always kept saying, because we were investors in Athena Health, Jonathan Bush's company, and that was a cloud-based system, and it was sort of like, how do we do best of breed? And it never got to the hospital fast enough. And so we need, I always thought, like, how are we going to get to the best of breed? Well, I think you're going to do this. You're going to backdoor into it with actually populating and creating a whole different EHR to create a longitudinal record for a patient.
So just back on the primary care,
Yeah.
I was fascinated to hear you say that you don't think that Amazon, JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway's venture is necessarily going to save the healthcare system. Obviously, some people are, and as you said, some people are running scared. What do you think? Where do you think it potentially falls down?
Well, I think right now it falls down on, I hate to say it, but on management and alignment of the interests of the parties that own it. I think they've got a phenomenal individual in Atul Gawande who's running it, but he's also running Aradni, his palliative care, so he has sort of his own research entity. And he's applying some of those research methodologies into Haven, but they don't have a team. And as I said to them from the beginning, if you're not creating this sort of independent for-profit entity, I'm afraid, where people are incented in a for-profit way, then you're not going to get the best people to come and figure this out. And again, maybe I'll be wrong. Over 5 years, they'll figure out something that's fantastic. But I can tell you, from our exposure to Amazon, they are not focused on it at all. They're focused on what they're doing within Amazon, and they're being very secretive about it. But you can see the pieces coming together. You can see PillPack. Well, obviously, drug distribution and sort of delivery to the home makes total sense to them. They're going to own that whole chain. You can see they've just are acquiring a primary care, an employer-based primary care group, and sort of rolling out clinics. So you could see that in terms of the virtual integration. And I talked about virtual primary care along with on-site. So they're moving, they're doing things that are really interesting.
I'll weigh in on that too. So I think their joint venture, or whatever they're calling it, is called Haven. And while I tend to agree with you that, at least for now, we haven't seen them make much progress, I think they're onto the right problem. The problem being what Buffett describes as the tapeworm of the US economy, which is healthcare. The fact that there's 150 million Americans who are insured through their employer is kind of a bizarre phenomenon to begin with, which dates back to post-World War II wage caps and the advent of employer-sponsored healthcare, which has obviously huge tax benefits associated with it, which encourages overspending and which over time has evolved, and employers have continued to use healthcare and associated benefits as a way to differentiate among themselves and to attract interesting and talented employees and to retain those employees. And so we've kind of come to a point where employers have sort of lost control. And even though they're the largest payer in the US healthcare system, they don't act like it. And so I think what Buffett and Amazon and JP Morgan have identified is something that needs to be changed. And with that comes opportunity. And there's a bunch of companies that are addressing those issues and doing it pragmatically and in a for-profit way, which I think is absolutely consistent with trying to solve these problems. And there are companies that are really interesting that we like a lot. Companies like Quantum, for example, and a business called Accolade they're kind of in this world of what they call healthcare navigation, where an employee doesn't know where to go, what doctor to see, how to address some sort of critical or chronic medical condition. There's a lot of also point solution technology companies that have come up to help address issues for employers. Livongo is one that's now public and is making headlines, and there's a bunch of others. And so it's a big problem, and it's not isolated to the employer, but we spend a lot of time thinking about the employer and how we can solve problems. And as a derivative, as I started earlier, the consumer and the employee, because what the employer is now doing is saying, okay, well, I'm just going to push more responsibility and make it the consumer's problem and turn what has been more of a defined contribution into or rather a defined benefit into a defined contribution, where they're saying, okay, we're going to pay this much, and then consumer, you go and through a high deductible or otherwise figure it out. And the employee and the consumer can't just be left to do that on their own. And so now there's all sorts of tools which are enabling that consumer to make better decisions, whether it's just simple stuff like transparency, understanding prices, which you would think in any industry around the world goes without saying. That's the foundation of business. There's a price and there's demand and supply, and consumers make decisions around whether they want to purchase it. Clearly, that's not the case in healthcare because of this archaic system that has developed over decades, and for reasons which I don't think were originally intended. But the good news for us is that it does create opportunity to try to solve these big problems, and I do think Haven is trying to address that. We'll see how successful.
And do you think, and I'm going to ask the other panelists this as well, but do you think that the political situation puts any of that innovation at risk?
Absolutely. I think if the industry doesn't self-regulate, and Annie was sort of speaking to this in some regard as she talked about technology actually exacerbating costs, which is counterintuitive by almost any standard. And I don't think she meant it to be all-encompassing. There are certainly technologies that are improving costs and productivity. But what I think this industry needs to do is address the issue of spiraling costs, and that will likely have to happen and is happening through payment reform. And that's something that CMS and CMMI have been spending enormous amounts of time trying to shift the risk dollar away from the traditional houses of risk, the insurance companies or the employer in some cases, to the provider organizations that need to deliver quality but need to also have a value orientation. And that is, we agree, part of the solution here. And if that's not accelerated, because frankly, it's not moving fast enough, then regulators will come over the top and impose things like Medicare for All, which has a bunch of different definitions and we could talk all day about, but which really doesn't at its foundation solve the problem. It sort of maintains more of a get paid for what you do paradigm, and that's actually going backward in time and probably to the detriment of overall care and the derivative impacts on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, and you're right. It's like, but I want as much pressure as possible on payers and providers. So I actually think, some government, some fear-mongering might be a good thing in the sense, and actually from an innovation perspective, it may not be good for legacy, but from an innovation perspective, I think it's a great thing, because then they're actually going to be, forced to think about, how do I deliver care differently? How do I think about insurance differently? And I think that's a good thing, and it's worth thinking about every solution possible in terms of payment reform and how do you lower costs and improve quality of life. At the end of the day,
you want
bring it on, bring the pressure on.
You want them scared of Amazon and scared of the government. Alex, what about in biotech? Is the political situation putting any of the innovation at risk?
Yeah, I believe it is. I mean, with the biotech it's very much about individual products that hopefully ameliorate or even cure a disease. And if you're successful there, you got to be able to kind of charge a price that allows sort of a decent ROI for the industry. It's a very, very hard business to be in. I mean, 10% of products that enter human testing work, right? So 90% of them fail. And if in an environment where people have to sort of effectively raise the sort of cost of capital of making these investments, there's a potential to sort of see it becoming harder to do that for fruitful things. I think that there's a spike when we talk of overall healthcare spending. I agree completely with what has been said here. With the specific part where it's on the spending on therapeutics, to me, it's sort of a natural process that as innovation has produced new therapies that were basically kind of untreated therapies for effectively untreatable diseases. Quality of life for society should go up, and that's a measure that one can argue about. But over the long term, it certainly has been, and it's reasonable to pay for that. So I would think as it's true for societies, for countries as they sort of economically become more developed, end up spending more on healthcare. It's like food, shelter, healthcare, and then you sort of spend more, and then also within a developed society, you're going to end up needing to incent people to do, the more innovative things. But there are lots of therapies, like we were involved as the medicines company was not approved drug, but an injection twice a year injection that, if approved, would be lowers cholesterol by 50%, and basically everyone who takes it. And that's something that, whatever the price point is, if it's something reasonable, it saves a lot of money for the healthcare system. So there's lots of those.
People just haven't been very good yet at being able to come up with those calculations and agree on what value for money is. Yeah,
well,
sure.
I think one thing, just to piggyback on what Alex said, and maybe it ties everything in, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of this, but when I started out, again, in the healthcare business, back in 2001, about 5 out of 10 prescriptions written by doctors were for generic drugs. Today, it's almost 9 out of 10. So the genericization of the pharmaceutical prescribing has largely happened. And another statistic that I think a lot of people don't appreciate is that of all healthcare dollars spent in the United States, only about 14% of it is on branded biopharmaceutical drugs. So it's a minority of healthcare spending, and as Alex alluded to, a lot of these drugs save lives. Reduce morbidity, keep patients out of the hospital where a lot of the cost incurs. So, in terms of finding dollars to save, big dollars to save in the overall healthcare system, targeting, that industry, which, they've been the scapegoat for years. I think you're not going to get the savings.
Right? Is
they have pretty good lobbyists.
The pharma industry will save 15% again and again. Yeah. I'm going to quickly open the floor for questions. Is there any questions?
I actually have one. We've got 2 drug people.
Oh, there's a mic coming.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah, it's pressure. So I'm interested, there's 2 drug people, 2 process people. Where do you see the Amazon of healthcare? Like, what is the big change that's just going to flip it? Because, to TJ's point, it's an archaic system with the pharmies, and drug pricing is sometimes a bit random, having worked with some of them. Do you see some big game changer, whether it be on a business model perspective for Annie and TJ, or on an innovation with, getting that drug to market quicker, for the LPs and the other funds in the room? Is that on the horizon anywhere on either?
I think probably everyone should speak to this. I believe it is. I believe that the system does. Everyone in the room would agree the system doesn't work well, and it takes time for these. There's a lot of kind of principal agent issues with changing the system. but enough pressure, as Annie mentioned, there's the political pressure, enough pressure, and people will be focusing on things that create value. Like I said, I think historically the pharma industry was sort of just sell a drug and get the most you can for it. Now the models have been much more about, or at least they're attempting to be much more about delivering an outcome or delivering some quality improvement. So I think that there'd be lots of incremental things like that, and there'll be some industries that are changed rapidly. There's been a lot of pressure on PBMs, for instance, like that. That's something that could be disintermediated.
The
Things like
pharmacy
that.
benefit managers.
Yes.
From within the industry, or does it come from, Bezos from outside, an account from Shaw that says warehousing? I got it. Like, is that? That's kind of what
It's going to be both, I think, and it's not just going to be inside the industry. I know other people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inside and out. I mean, I think CMS actually under this administration has been great. I think TJ mentioned in terms of payment models that they're working on that are really, changing primary care, kidney care, moving away from dialysis centers. So I think it's very much around the payment models they're driving. I think that actually the most interesting thing they're working on, and you touched on this, and you think about other countries and what they do. We have a healthcare bucket, and in fact we have a healthcare that's really focused on physical care, not social determinants of health, and not mental. Like integrating mental health care with physical health care, medical care. And the way we think about it is, we have a food stamp program, right, that 10% of Americans get. And we have HUD over here. And so we have all these social services that affect these people. And you look at Medicaid, it's the homeless that cost the most money. And so it was fascinating. I just saw today that United is actually investing in apartments and putting people that in their Medicaid programs in apartments and in homes. And looking at the dollar cost, because some of these people are spending $12,000 a month on showing up. They referenced somebody who spent 170 days in the ER, and it's a lot less expensive to get somebody home. And so if you think about employment, if you think about all the money that's being spent, not just in the healthcare bucket on these people, then you look at, okay, what we can take the food stamp money and some HUD money and and they're looking at creating a model where we actually look at taking care of the whole person, getting them in, because once you get somebody home, then they might actually think about getting employment, and feeding them properly. So putting the social determinants of health all wrapping around that with healthcare is probably going to make the biggest difference in the next decade.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but if you have a 2-sentence answer to that question, I'll leave it open for you guys.
Look, for there to be a one sort of pivotal event to occur, I think it has to be related to our overall fiscal situation as a country, and someone's going to have to decide not to lend us money at 0% interest rates for that to, I think, really catalyze the type of change. Maybe it occurs through the political process. Maybe it occurs with an Elizabeth Warren in office. I think the hurdles to actually doing what she suggests.
I think there are shivers in people's spines.
Are very substantial. So I don't see that happening. But I think it will take something really extraordinary and exogenous like that to have some real revolutionary change. Other than that, I think it will be evolutionary, but still going in the right direction.
And I'll give just two sort of crystal ball, one low tech, one high tech. Geisinger Health Systems in Pennsylvania, I've read they've got an innovative program where they're paying for groceries for their low-income diabetics and buying healthy foods, and it's saving quite a bit of money in terms of again keeping patients out of the ER, reducing the amount of insulin and other expensive medications they're on. And then the other thing, bigger picture, and I don't know who's going to do this, but in medical school, we learn something called the differential diagnosis, and that's how doctors diagnose patients with illnesses. It's essentially an algorithm. Computers are very good at algorithms, and I think someday, some company is going to figure out, a way to democratize, the diagnosis and management of patients. And when that happens, that there's a lot of dollars to be saved in that aspect of treating patients.
Well, thank you all so much. We've got a lot of hope and opportunity, which is unusual.
Thank you.
The 2019 Greenwich Economic Forum is brought to you by Bridgewater Associates, Meaningful work, meaningful relationships. Churchill Asset Management, Nuveen, a leading provider of senior and unitranche debt to middle market companies. Ropes & Gray, bright past, brilliant future. Aurora Capital, inspiring partnerships. And Gramercy Funds Management, we are emerging markets. Special considerations to Bank of America, life's better when we're connected. Noah Private Wealth Management, a leading wealth and asset management service provider in China. Guotai Jinan Futures, a leading brokerage firm for commodity futures and financial futures in China. China Industrial Securities, a comprehensive financial group providing full spectrum financial services in Hong Kong. And Titan Advisors, built like a hedge fund. Special thanks to the Financial Times and Greenwich Business Institute for hosting us. And thank you to all the sponsors who helped make this event possible. We'll be right back after these messages. Don't go away.